Listen up, night owls and dawn dreamers, because tonight we're plunging headfirst into the bizarre, candlelit world of medieval sleep. Brace yourselves, because this tale is going to turn your ideas about bedtime upside down and maybe have you rethinking that 2:00 a.m. stare down with your ceiling fan before you even think about fluffing your pillow. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're intrigued by the dusty secrets of history. Don't forget to tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you're tucked in snug or wide awake like a medieval goat herder on Fox Patrol. Dim the lights, crank that background fan for some ominous white noise, and settle in for a journey through the dark, drafty nights of medieval Europe. We're about to unearth a sleeping routine, so alien, you'll be wondering how your ancestors didn't just roll over and give up on sleep entirely. This isn't some modern sleep hygiene TikTok challenge, it's a real, centuries-old bedtime ritual that would make your Fitbit gasp in horror. Back then, sleep wasn't a single, uninterrupted stretch of cozy dreams and quiet snoring. Oh no, my friend. Medieval folks followed something called segmented sleep, and it was as weird as it sounds. Imagine your night sliced in two like a stale loaf of rye, bread first sleep, then second sleep, with a whole lot of midnight activity in between. And no, they weren't just tossing and turning. They were getting up. They were busy. They were downright social. Picture it. The sun sets behind the mossy hills of your muddy village. Your tallow candle sputters out, and you crawl into your scratchy straw mattress, drifting off into the first phase of your slumber. This first sleep wasn't a power nap or a restless dozite. It was a full-on sleep, deep and blissful, as if you'd finally given up trying to count the fleas in your straw bed. 4 hours later, your eyes snap open, but you don't panic. You don't curse the darkness. You sit up, because this, dear friends, is the mystical, restless hour between the first and second sleep. During this midnight interval, you might shuffle over to the hearth and poke at the embers, adding another log and listening to the wood crackle like the night's heartbeat. Or maybe you light a small rushlight, essentially a stick dipped in animal fatso. You can read from a battered prayer book or a manuscript of herbal remedies that promises to cure everything from a sore back to a broken heart. And if you're lucky enough to be literate, not exactly common back then, you might even scribble out a few lines of poetry before the ink freezes solid. For many, this was a time to tend to the living. Livestock had a bad habit of getting into trouble while everyone else slept. So you'd slip outside in your woolen cloak to make sure the goats hadn't wandered off to join a druid's coven and the chickens were still snug in their roosts. Nothing ruins your dream of becoming a traveling bard like waking up to find your prize goose has been eaten by a fox. But this medieval midnight wasn't all work and worry. There was also, well, let's just say a little romance. That's right, according to the medieval marriage manuals, this was the best time for a couple to get cozy. After 4 hours of restful sleep, the body was refreshed, the mind was calm, and the complaints of the day had faded into the dark. One 14th century medical writer even noted that the watch hour was ideal for marital duties, as he put it. So next time you wake up at 2:00 a.m. and think about grabbing your phone, just remember that your ancestors were probably finding a much more intimate way to pass the time. Then, after this watchful, active period, people would drift back into a second sleep that carried them straight through until the rooster crowed and the thin winter sun crept over the hills. It wasn't just the peasants and shepherds living like this. Monks in their stone cloisters, nobles in their drafty halls, even Geoffrey of Chaucer himself wrote about these two sleeps, as if they were as natural as the turning of the seasons. Modern scientists have even suggested that this segmented sleep might be closer to what our bodies actually crave: two smaller chunks of rest, rather than one long marathon. So if you find yourself wide-eyed at 3:00 a.m., try whispering to the darkness, "The watch has begun," and imagine you're keeping vigil in a world lit only by stars. Of course, this mystical midnight routine wasn't the only weirdness in medieval sleep. Let's talk about where they actually slept, or what they called a bed. Forget your plush memory foam mattress. Forget your bed frame that adjusts at the touch of a button. In the medieval world, A bed was often just a sad pile of straw stuffed into a scratchy sack if you were lucky, or simply scattered across the dirt floor if you weren't. The typical peasant bed was called a pallet, and it was about as fancy as it sounds. Hay or straw, sometimes mixed with dry leaves or old rushes, crammed into a coarse linen sack that was more patches than cloth. It smelled of earth and sweat, and the faint hint of livestock that shared your cramped cottage. And let's not even start on the insects. Fleas, lice, the occasional curious field mouse, these were your bedfellows, whether you invited them or not. If you were wealthy enough to own an actual bed frame, made of creaky wood and lifted just a few feet off the ground, you were living like a lord. It didn't change much about the lumps in your mattress, but at least you weren't sharing your pillow with a family of beetles. And let's be real, some of those medieval bed frames were more rickety than a ship's mast in a storm. One good flop onto the feather mattress, if you were so lucky to have one, could send the whole thing crashing like a scene from a traveling minstrel's slapstick routine. Linen sheets, those were for the rich. Most folks slept in the same rough woolen tunic they wore all day, crusted with dust and sweat and whatever else the day had thrown at them. Pajamas weren't really a thing, and neither was personal space. Families huddled together on the same straw pallet, limbs tangled in a desperate bid to keep warm in the winter chill. If you wanted to roll over, you'd better hope your uncle didn't snore like a war horn, because that was your new lullaby. Nobles, of course, had it better. Their beds were high affairs with heavy wooden frames, thick feather mattresses, and embroidered covers so fancy they'd make your grandmother's best quilt look like a dish rag. They had canopies to keep out the draft, and curtains to keep out the gossip. These beds were so valuable, they were passed down in Wills Imagine, inheriting your aunt's suspiciously lumpy mattress as your only family treasure. But even those fancy feather beds didn't guarantee a peaceful night. Drafty stone walls let in cold winds that whistled like vengeful spirits. Windows were made of thin horn or oiled cloth, rattling in the breeze. Central heating? That was called a dog. And if you were lucky, the family mutt would curl up by your feet and share a bit of warmth. If not, well, enjoy your frostbitten toes. And speaking of staying warm, let's take a moment to honor the humble nightcap. Today, when you hear nightcap, you might think of a whiskey-laced drink by the fireside, a warm glow of alcohol, and questionable decisions. But in the medieval world, a nightcap was a literal hat. A long, sometimes pointy hat, made of whatever scraps of wool or linen you could find, because nothing says bedtime fashion like a cone of fabric that would make a wizard jealous. For men, it was a sensible way to stop their hair from freezing into icicles overnight. For women, the nightcap often doubled as a head wrap, a symbol of modesty and warmth all in one. And let's be honest, some of these hats look so silly they could have doubled as carnival costumes. But when the frost crept in and the winds howled through the wooden slats of your home, you'd thank every stitch of that hat for keeping your scalp attached to your skull. And so, as you drift off tonight in your climate-controlled bedroom with your weighted blanket and your lavender-scented sleep mist, spare a thought for those medieval dreamers. They didn't have sleep apps or blackout curtains. They had segmented sleep, scratchy straw beds, and the persistent itch of fleas. But somehow, they made it work, proving that even in the darkest nights, a little warmth, a little humor, and a lot of determination can carry you through. All right, fellow wanderers of the night, gather round, because tonight we're going to slip through the creaky wooden doors of the medieval bedroom and into the eccentric, candlelit world of nighttime rituals you never learned about in history class. Trust me, by the end of this tale, you'll be rethinking everything you thought you knew about going to bed, yes, even that embarrassing hat you only wear when no one's looking. Before you even think of dozing off, do me a favor, click that like button, subscribe if you're as curious as a cat in a nunnery, and leave me a note in the comments about what ungodly hour you're tuning in from. Let's see if anyone else is awake at this unholy hour. Let's set the mood. Picture a freezing room with stone walls that could double as a cheese cellar, a floor littered with straw, and a draft so fierce it might as well be a ghost with a personal vendetta. In this world, the humble nightcap was more than a fashion statement. It was your first line of defense against the icy breath of medieval architecture. These head wraps, lovingly sewn by wives, sisters, or traveling peddlers with questionable hygiene were as essential to sleep as closing your eyes. The logic was simple. Heat escapes from your scalp, and if you want to keep your brains from becoming popsicles, you cover it up. So these caps came in all shapes and levels of questionable taste. Some were embroidered with bright patterns, others were just leftover scraps from last year's tunic, and a few were so pointy they'd make a wizard's hat look conservative. For married women, the stakes were even higher. It was considered downright scandalous to let your hair down at night if you had a husband snoring beside you. Medieval matrons were expected to cover their heads around the clock, yes, even when counting sheep. And if you had a bit of coin to spare, you might get your nightcap dyed, a fetching shade of woad blue, or embroidered with a family crest, because nothing says, "I've made it," like a hat that declares your wealth to the dust mites and occasional bedbug. In the bustling towns and markets, that nightcap had a whole different meaning. Imagine you're up late, and there's a knock at your door, maybe a lost traveler, maybe the town watch checking for contraband ale. If you opened the door wearing your nightcap, it was the medieval equivalent of answering in your bathrobe. Nope, not tonight, friend. Go find your gossip elsewhere. The nightcap was the polite way of saying, I am off the clock. And if you value your shins, you'll take your business elsewhere. Of course, the nightcap was usually paired with the nightshirt, a garment that wouldn't win any fashion shows today. Picture an oversized tunic that reached your knees, scratchy as a cat's tongue, and prone to catching fire if you slept too close to the embers. The medieval nightshirt was about as glamorous as an itchy sack of potatoes, but in a world where fashion took a back seat to not freezing to death, no one cared. Speaking of sleeping arrangements, let's travel to a medieval inn. Picture this. You're a weary traveler. Your donkey gave out 3 miles back, and you finally stumble upon a flickering sign promising a night's rest. A room, you whisper, or at least a corner to curl up in. But what you get isn't a private chamber with a mint on the pillow. No, you're shown to a bed that's already half occupied. Welcome to the medieval dormitory experience, where beds were shared by complete strangers, and personal space was a foreign concept. Beds weren't so much personal sanctuaries as communal benches of exhaustion. If there was room, you were sharing. 2, 3, even 4 strangers might be snoring shoulder to shoulder, a symphony of snores and midnight grumbles. In some of the bigger towns, you'd find vast sleeping halls, like the world's worst hostel, with row after row of straw-filled mattresses and absolutely zero privacy. Elbow room was a competitive sport, and the only thing separating you from the coughing, snoring man beside you was your shared disgust for the lice in the straw. And while inns sometimes tried to be orderly, sorting travelers by trade merchants with merchants, priests with priests, pickpockets with pickpockets, the truth was, if there was space, you were in. The concept of the snoring lottery was real. Who you ended up next to depended entirely on the luck of your arrival time. Women and men were usually separated, but in the crowded corners of the kingdom, even that line could blur if the innkeeper had enough mead in his gut. Worried about theft? You should be. Many travelers learned to sleep with their coin purse tied tightly to their belt or hidden beneath their clothes. Others slept directly on their traveling packs, transforming them into makeshift pillows and personal alarm systems. Move the bag, and you'd better believe someone's waking up swinging. Meanwhile, the nobility had no patience for this cramped camaraderie. Nobles traveled with retinues of servants and guards, demanding private rooms or pitching elaborate traveling tents, complete with velvet hangings and enough feather beds to start a small pillow empire. But for the rest of the weary world, a shared bed was a luxury compared to the cold, muddy roadside. Yet sleeping arrangements in the medieval age were more than a matter of comfort. For many, bedtime was a spiritual gamble. Death could sneak up like a shadow at the edge of your flickering candle, and everyone knew it. Before you slipped beneath your woolen blanket, you made your peace just in case the night was your last. Medieval folk didn't dabble in bedtime yoga or sleep podcasts. They prepared for the possibility of never waking up. This was the hour of whispered prayers, of invoking saints and confessing your sins with the cold air biting at your toes. Forget essential oils and weighted blankets. Medieval sleep hygiene was all about cleansing your soul. One popular prayer began, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sounds sweet, right? Until you realize it was basically your final will and testament, hastily delivered in the dark. Parents taught their children to recite these prayers, partly to keep them quiet, and partly to reassure themselves that angels, or at least the household dog, were watching over them. In wealthier homes, this nightly ritual was elevated to an art form. Nobles gathered in candlelit chambers, murmuring prayers as if they were signing contracts with the heavens. The truly devout, the monks and nuns, ended their days with the ritual of Compline, a final service of the night that sealed their souls in a bubble of sacred protection. After Compline, the rule of silence began. Not because they wanted to, because no one had the energy left to speak. When your dinner was half a turnip, and your daily chores included hauling water and wrestling with a stubborn ox, even the smallest prayer felt monumental. Children weren't spared these nightly rituals either. They were taught that angels hovered above their straw beds, recording every fidget and whispered complaint. "Watch yourself," their mothers would say. "The angels see everything." And though it was meant to comfort, it probably sounded more like a medieval surveillance program to small ears. So, as you drift off tonight, tucked under a comforter made of actual down instead of chicken feathers, remember those medieval souls who went to bed each night with a prayer on their lips, a hat on their head, and a healthy fear of the afterlife. They didn't have nightlights or podcasts to soothe them into slumber, just the hope that morning would come again, bringing another day of toil, faith, and the occasional lice inspection. All right, gather round, night creatures and dreamers, because tonight we're diving headlong into the shadowy world of medieval sleep rituals, where everything from nightcaps to dream confessions turned bedtime into a cosmic event. Forget your silk pajamas and chamomile tea. These folks were snuggling up with goats, haunted by visions, and terrified that their dreams might reveal more than just their guilty cravings for yesterday's leftover goose. But first, hit that like button, subscribe if your curiosity's still buzzing at this hour, and drop a comment to tell me what unholy hour you're tuning in from. Let's see who else is dancing with the midnight spirits. Now, back in those drafty centuries, sleep wasn't just about catching some shut-eye. It was a nightly journey through the heavens and hells of your own Sula gamble, that you'd wake up in the morning not just cold and cranky, but possibly cleansed or cursed forever. The medieval mind took dreams very seriously. We're talking soul on the line serious. Let's start with those late-night visions. In a world without neon lights and TikTok reels, dreams were believed to be windows into the diviner demonic. Imagine you're a farmer named Wolfstan, snoozing on a pile of straw, and you dream of a woman with a deer's antlers, offering you a golden apple. Today you chalk it up to that weird cheese you found under the bench. But back then, Wolfstan would be at the monastery door at dawn, begging Brother Athelred to tell him if he was about to be crowned king or dragged straight to the fiery pits of hell. Theologians and spiritual gatekeepers of the age monks, nuns, and that guy who always claimed to have the ear of St. Peter pored over dreams like they were decoding a secret message from the clouds. Entire scrolls of dream guides were written to help sort out whether that vision of a talking fish was a cosmic sign or just your stomach growling. A dream of fire could be a warning of eternal damnation, or maybe you just slept too close to the hearth again. A vision of crystal clear water? That was trickier. Was it a sign of spiritual cleansing, or a grim hint that you'd soon be sleeping with the fishes literally? And then there were the nightmares, the devil's own playground. Waking up in a cold sweat after seeing a demon juggling eggs? Best confess that one. And maybe fast for a week, just to be safe. Monks and nuns didn't just keep these midnight tales to themselves. They dutifully scribbled down every dream in the margins of their prayer books, like the original sleep journals, but with more fire and brimstone. Some were praised for receiving what they believed were divine messages. Others were quietly advised to stop eating pickled eels before bed. Dreams weren't just personal worries, they were spiritual currency. A nun might dream of a stairway of light and wake up revered as a holy visionary. A knight could dream of a black dog and fear it was a sign of his impending doom in battle. And let's be honest, if you'd spent all day trudging through mud and praying to every saint you could name, you might start dreaming of weird omens too. But dreams were also the medieval Netflix. Writers like Sir Thomas of the Thorny Quill wove elaborate stories of knights battling dragons in dream worlds, of queens visited by heavenly figures who scolded them for sleeping in on feast days. These stories had everything mystic symbolism, moral lectures, and definitely no happy endings. Medieval literature was basically a sleepover horror story set to a Gregorian chant. Of course, the church had opinions. Not every dream was a message from the Almighty. Some were believed to be direct demonic attacks, spiritual sabotage meant to corrupt the innocent. If you woke up blushing from a steamy dream, you weren't just embarrassed, you were at risk of eternal damnation. Cue the frantic confessions and the suspicious glances from the confessor, who was definitely judging your subconscious. But medieval sleep wasn't just about what happened in your head, it was also about who or what was sharing your bed. Let's talk about the unconventional bedmates of the Middle Ages. Forget your cuddly labradoodle. In those icy huts and castle corners, sharing a bed with animals was practically a survival tactic. Chickens weren't just your breakfast, they were your hot water bottle. Dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snored softly in the corner, and if you were really down on your luck, you might wake up spooning a goat who decided your straw bed was the best place to chew cud at midnight. This wasn't a matter of affection, though medieval folks were fond of their critters. It was about warmth. In a world where walls were thinner than a gossip's patience, every scrap of body heat mattered. A cow in the corner could lift the temperature by a few blessed degrees, a small miracle in January's freezing dark. In those one-room homes, families and animals slept side by side. Parents huddled with children, children curled up against dogs, chickens roosting wherever they pleased. Hygiene? Well, let's not get too precious. For the wealthier, things weren't quite so livestock adjacent. Nobles weren't keen on sharing their silken sheets with the family pig, but even they might let lapdogs hop in status symbols as much as companions. The grandest castles even had dedicated sleeping quarters for prized hounds. Imagine being so rich your dog has a better room than most people. Of course, there were downsides. Animals were noisy. They wandered, snored, and had no respect for your need for a full night's sleep. Waking up to a hoof in the face wasn't an exception. It was just another part of the nightly ritual. Medieval folks took it in stride. After all, it was better than freezing alone in the night. But if you thought that was crowded, let me introduce you to the medieval monastery dormitoria place, where comfort went to die and silence was enforced like a vow. Picture rows of wooden cots, each with a thin straw mattress if you were lucky, lined up like soldiers in a holy army. No privacy, no curtains, just the cold reality of communal piety. Monks didn't sleep sprawled luxuriously. They slept fully clothed, always ready for the call to prayer. Forget your fancy sleepwear. These men of God wore the same itchy tunic by day and night, because who had time to change when your soul was on the line? The air was heavy with candle smoke, stale bread, and the faint, persistent tang of incense. And beneath it all, the low, rhythmic snores of men who'd spent the day toiling in fields, copying texts, and definitely not skipping their prayers. No one spoke. That was the rule. After the final prayers of the day Compline, they called Insolence fell like a hammer. The only sounds were the rustle of straw and the occasional creak of ancient wood under the weight of a weary monk. You didn't dare break that silence. Not because of punishment, though that was a real possibility, but because silence was holy. It was the closest thing to a spiritual cleanse you could get in a world that never stopped moving. In the quiet darkness, monks drifted into sleep, knowing that the night was a trial of its own. They dreamt of angels, of demons, of heavenly choirs and hellish temptations. And in the morning, they'd rise to pray again, to tend their gardens and copy out the words of the saints each day, a small echo of the larger rhythm of faith that shaped their lives. So tonight, as you fluff your pillow and slip under a comforter thicker than any straw mattress ever dreamed of, think of them, those medieval souls who went to bed in cold, crowded rooms, heads covered in nightcaps, hearts full of prayers and fears and dreams they dared not ignore. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to crawl out of bed at 2 a.m., not for a midnight snack or a quick scroll through cat videos, but to recite ancient prayers in a stone-cold monastery? Brace yourself, because tonight we're unraveling the bizarre sleep routines of medieval monastic life, where personal space didn't exist, comfort was a foreign word, and even your snores could land you in spiritual trouble. Let's kick this off with a gentle warning. If you're cozy right now under a mountain of blankets, you might want to stay there, because this is a bedtime story for the agesmanous, the comfort. In the eerie gloom of the monastery, where shadows flickered across cold stone walls, and every creak of ancient wood echoed like a whispered curse, the brothers of the Order of St. Brannock rose each night for what they called matins. But don't be fooled by the noble-sounding name. This was no gentle dawn chorus. It was an icy, candlelit shuffle, where sleep-deprived souls tried not to trip over their own robes as they made their way to the chapel. Picture Brother Edric, blinking blearily as he tugged on his threadbare robe, the scratchy wool a constant reminder that comfort was a sin to be purged. In this place, luxury was a dirty word, and anything soft or warm was suspect. The monastery's dormitory, ironically dubbed the Hall of Rest, was a cavernous space lined with rows of wooden planks masquerading as beds. No mattresses of down here, just straw-filled sacks that crunched under your weight and smelled faintly of old barley and desperate prayers. Brother Edric wasn't alone in his nightly ordeal. Next to him, Brother Wulfstan fumbled with his sandals, muttering under his breath about how the cold was surely a test of faith. Sister Alfgifu, visiting from a nearby convent, tried to keep her eyes on her psalter instead of the flickering shadows, convinced that every creak was the devil come to steal her soul. And across the way, poor Brother Oswin had already managed to doze off again, earning him a swift flick to the ear from the ever-watchful Brother Prior, who considered snoring a moral failing. In the darkness, only one candle sputtered, throwing monstrous shapes across the walls. But no one dared complain. Silence was the first rule of the dormitory, and to break it was to risk being assigned to clean the chamber pots for a week of fate that made even the cold seem merciful. Sleep itself wasn't something to look forward to here. It was merely a brief truce with consciousness, a chance to lie still and not sin, wrapped in a robe that doubled as both spiritual armor and threadbare insulation. There were no pillows, no warm sheets, and absolutely no privacy curtains. If you managed to drift off without Brother Edric's cold toes poking your calf, or Sister Alfgifu's elbow in your ribs, you counted yourself blessed. But the true test of endurance came not in sleep, but in the waking. At 2 a.m., as the rest of the world slumbered, the bell would toll a sound that cut through dreams like a blade. Brother Edric would jolt upright, heart pounding as he groped for his sandals in the near dark. No one spoke. Voices were for the chapel, not the dormitory. They filed out, bleary-eyed and shivering, to the frigid stone of the nave, where matins awaited. In the chapel, Brother Edric would stand shoulder to shoulder with his brothers and sisters, chanting psalms in Latin that rolled through the cold air like breathless ghosts. The flickering candles cast long shadows, turning each monk into a towering wraith. Eyes drooped, knees locked. And if you dared to let your head bob forward in sleep, the punishment was swift. Extra chores, more prayers, or a lecture from the prior about the virtues of self-denial. Some orders stretched matins to an hour, others to 2, because nothing says spiritual devotion like chanting psalms on an empty stomach, half frozen and entirely convinced that your soul depended on it. Once matins was done, most monks stumbled back to their plank beds for the so-called second sleep, but not all were so lucky. In stricter orders, the day began in earnest. Labor in the fields, study in the cloisters, or hours of hand-copying manuscripts by flickering lamplight. Why this nocturnal ritual? In the mind of Brother Edric, it was a test of will, a sacrifice of warmth and comfort to prove devotion. In reality, it was a curious blend of spiritual duty and ancient superstition. The darkness was a place of temptation, the time when devils prowled and the soul was most vulnerable. By rising in the dead of night, Monks believed they could armor themselves in faith, forging a shield of prayer to keep the night's shadows at bay. Yet, for all its austerity, the monastery wasn't the only place where sleep was communal and suspiciously social. In the peasant cottages beyond the monastery walls, sleep was a crowded affair. Families, parents, children, and the occasional traveling cousin would huddle together in a single straw-strewn corner. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. A bed wasn't a place to rest so much as a survival tactic, a pile of warmth in a world where winter didn't knock politely but crashed through the door like an uninvited guest. In those low-roofed homes, even the livestock played a part. A chicken might roost at the foot of the straw pile, a dog might curl up at your side, and if you were particularly unlucky, the family goat might decide that your blanket was a snack worth sampling at 3 a.m. But who could blame them? The world was cold, the night was long, and warmth was everything. And while the poor might have snored and shuffled together for heat, the wealthy had their own quirks. The grand beds of the nobility were masterpieces of carpentry, draped in tapestries and lined with feather mattresses so thick they could swallow a small child whole. Yet even these beds were rarely the domain of just two. Servants slept nearby, ready to stoke the fire or chase away the mice that thought feather beds were the perfect nesting ground. Privacy was for the privileged and the solitary something the medieval mind found deeply suspicious. Because in the medieval world, to sleep alone was to sleep exposed. The night was a place of spirits and shadows, where even the bravest soul might falter without a warm body nearby to share the burden of darkness. And so Brother Edric would return each night to his plank, settle back into his robe, and dream if he dared to dream at all of a world where sleep was a blessing, not a battleground. But don't be fooled. In the monastery, there was no luxury in slumber. It was a brief, hard-fought ceasefire in the endless war of the spirit, a moment when even the most pious could slip, and when the echoes of chanting still rang in your ears long after you closed your eyes. Because here, sleep wasn't just rest, it was a test of faith, one that began again every night, as sure as the cold dawn and the silent prayers that followed. Have you ever thought of sleeping alone as a treat? Well, in medieval times, it was practically an invitation for mischief, or at the very least, a suspicious act that could land you in spiritual hot water. In the candlelit world of the 14th century, sleeping in a solitary bed was considered downright scandalous. After all, if you were alone in bed, who would stop you from drifting into sinful dreams or suspicious thoughts? If there was one thing medieval folks understood, it was that group sleep meant accountability, and solitary snoozing was practically a ticket to temptation. So tonight, as you sink into your warm bed in a room that doesn't smell like goat hair and last month's cabbage stew, remember this. You'd likely have a cousin or two, a woolly sheepdog, and maybe even that traveling merchant from 2 villages over snoring in the same space with you. Personal space? Huh, that was for the saintser, the truly reckless. Now, imagine you've nodded off in your dentist's waiting room, or halfway through a meeting, only to jolt awake with that embarrassing neck crick. In medieval days, though, sleeping upright wasn't some mortifying accident, it was a lifestyle choice for the elite or those chasing spiritual enlightenment. Picture Sir Ranulph, the pious, who preferred sleeping propped up like a half-fallen tapestry rather than lying down. Why? For starters, there was a widespread belief that sleeping flat on your back was practically an engraved invitation for all sorts of bodily troubles. Poor digestion, breathlessness, and even brace your self-congestion of the brain. Medieval doctors might have prescribed leeches and potions made of boiled newts, but they swore by upright sleeping as the surest way to keep the humors flowing in harmonious balance. Of course, the spiritual worries were even more dramatic. Lying flat was said to mimic the posture of the dead, and nobody wanted to confuse God, or worse, accidentally woo the angel of death by looking like you were already halfway to the grave. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your priest also played village doctor, you learned not to ask too many questions. So how did folks pull this off? Nobles rigged their beds with angled wooden supports, turning the bedchamber into a medieval recliner showroom. It wasn't just about dinner digestion. It was about staying one step ahead of any lurking demon who might mistake your peaceful slumber for an open invitation to sneak into your dreams. And if you were particularly devoted, like Brother Evo of the monastic order of St. Beatrix, forget about the bed entirely. Monks of stricter orders slept upright on benches, leaning against icy stone walls with nothing but a threadbare hood for comfort. The thinking was simple. If you got too cozy, you might start dreaming, and if you dreamed, you might sin. And sin, of course, meant confessing your shame to a bleary-eyed abbot at 5 a.m. Let's be real, this wasn't about sweet dreams or quality rest. It was about discipline, discomfort, and a spiritual workout that made every night a battle of endurance. And while you might be grateful for your memory foam pillow, remember, the real medieval monsters weren't nightmares or goblins under the bed. They were already in the sheets. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs weren't just an annoyance. They were the true rulers of medieval bedrooms. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's crowning achievement. Baths were a rare luxury. Laundry was an expensive chore. And soap was, let's just say, it had more in common with medieval cauldrons than gentle lavender-scented bars. Add to this the straw mattresses shared by families and the odd barnyard pet, and you've got a pest paradise like no other. For peasants, fleas were part of the daily grind, tiny hopping reminders that you were still alive and breathing. Nobles, despite their velvety sheets and feather pillows, were just as vulnerable. In fact, some noble houses even employed official nitpickers, servants tasked with plucking lice from their lord's flowing hair like personal scalp gardeners. Imagine that job description: royal itch manager. As for bedbugs, they were the stealth assassins of the night. They hid in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in the seams of straw mattresses, and even in the cold nooks of stone walls, emerging at night for a feast. If you've ever woken up in a hotel room convinced something's crawling on you, medieval folks would nod knowingly. Nightcaps and long nightshirts weren't just about warmth. They were primitive battle armor against the six-legged armies that treated your bed as a buffet. Solutions? Let's call them creative. Some families burned herbs like wormwood to ward off the bugs, while others slept with garlic, onions, or ashes in the bedless pest control. More olfactory punishment. The result? Romance took a back seat, and if you woke up next to a reeking clove of garlic, you just accepted it as part of the medieval charm. Fleas and lice weren't just physical torment, they were seen as tiny, hopping moral lessons. Many believed these bloodsuckers were punishment for sin, a bite-sized reminder of your own spiritual failings. And yes, in true medieval fashion, people even wrote poems about them. Some were moralistic, others weirdly affectionate. Because nothing says love like comparing your passion to the flea biting you both. But speaking of discomfort, you ever considered falling asleep wearing 100 pounds of iron? In the medieval age, some knights actually did. Not because they wanted to, but because war waits for no man's bedtime routine. During campaigns or castle sieges, Sir Emeric the Sturdy might keep his breastplate strapped on as he drifted off, just in case some overzealous raiders decided to knock politely by battering down the door at midnight. Most knights wouldn't sleep in full armor. Too hot, too loud, too much of a rolling hazard, but a bit of chainmail or a breastplate? Absolutely. Helmets and gauntlets could come off, but the rest stayed on. Swords or axes served as bedtime accessories, always within reach for that just-in-case midnight brawl. Shields doubled as headrestless than ideal for comfort, but essential if you didn't want to wake up to a dagger in the ribs. Of course, sleeping like this wasn't about catching zis, it was about survival. Cold stone floors, flickering torches, and the muffled snores of your fellow warriors created an atmosphere that ranked somewhere below airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those traveling in less perilous lands sometimes kept a dagger close, just in case. So next time you grumble about your scratchy pajamas or the neighbor's loud TV, just remember, you're not wearing 50 pounds of steel, you're not battling fleas, and you're certainly not trying to keep death's attention away by propping yourself up like a medieval scarecrow. Count your blessings after all. You don't have a cousin and 2 goats hogging your bed tonight. Unless, of course, that's your thing. Imagine drifting off to sleep with a dagger under your pillow, a cow snoring in the corner, and the chance of the local priest barging in to check if your soul's still attached. That's the medieval bedtime vibe. If you were traveling, maybe a merchant peddling your wares, or a guard tasked with watching over your lord's treasuress sleeping in quilted jackets called gambres was your version of luxury. These thick, padded coats offered a smidge of comfort and a touch of protection, though they squeaked and rustled like an anxious mouse in a bread bin every time you turned over. Forget the squeaky bed frame of your last Airbnb stay armor was the real sleep killer. Even dozing in a half suit of mail, you risk clanking so loudly you'd wake the entire encampment, sending your companions into a bleary-eyed panic at the imagined apocalypse. And in a world already brimming with demons, lice, and the occasional pig snuffling in your straw bed, that was the last thing you needed. But let's talk about the real medieval horror: sleepwalking. Today, we might chalk it up to stress, but back then, if you started wandering around in your sleep, it was cause for alarm. People didn't think you just had a lot on your mind. They thought you'd been bewitched, or that Satan was hosting a rehearsal dinner using your body as a puppet. Take the story of Alaric the baker, who would rise from his straw pallet at midnight, eyes blank, mumbling in a language he never learned, possibly Latin, possibly nonsense, and wander straight through the common room, stepping over sleeping dogs and half-finished tankards of ale. Neighbors didn't think, "Poor Alaric, he's tired." They thought, "Call Father Osmond, this man's soul has checked out." The medieval term for this was noctambulation, fancy talk for sleepwalking, but it was anything but fancy in practice. Some believed it was caused by an imbalance of the black bile, the catch-all diagnosis for anything from a cough to demonic possession. Others figured that while you slept, your soul popped out to run errands, leaving your poor, empty body to stumble around like a lost goat. So what did medieval folks do? Herbal remedies were popular sprigs of rosemary, tucked under the pillow, or strong-smelling concoctions you'd rather not sniff twice. Prayers were essential, with charms of iron or even tying the sleepwalker's leg to a chair so they wouldn't accidentally wander into the hearth and become a cautionary tale by sunrise. And it got even weirder. Stories circulated of sleepwalkers scaling rooftops in the moonlight. Whether or not these were tales embroidered with fear, the anxiety was real. Entire villages debated whether these wanderings counted as sin. Could you be held accountable for what you did in your sleep? Some priests said yes. Others said just tie the man to a chair and move on. Most sleepwalkers didn't dance across rooftops, though. They muttered, shuffled, or tried to open doors that didn't exist, giving everyone else a heart attack in the process. If a sleepwalker found their way into a church, locals took it as a sign either divine or very suspicious. Some called for a cleansing ritual. Others just locked the doors at night and hoped for the best. In the end, medieval folks learned to sleep through nearly anything. Church bells clanging at ungodly hours? Check. Thunder shaking the roof? Check. Sleepwalking cousin flapping around in a nightshirt like a ghostly duck? Check. This was the medieval lullaby. Chaos was just part of the melody. Take the bells, for example. Bells marked everything's unrise. Prayers, meals, and those 2 a.m. prayer vigils that were less about spiritual enlightenment and more about not dozing off while Brother Gerald read psalms in a voice like wet parchment. If you lived near a monastery, your sleep schedule wasn't yours, it belonged to the rhythm of the bell tower. At some point, you just stopped hearing it. The brain accepted it like background noise, the medieval version of a white noise machine, except you couldn't turn it off. Thunderstorms were a whole other story. No fancy weather apps in the Middle Ages. When the clouds gathered, you braced yourself. Roofs leaked like colanders, windows rattled, and the wind moaned like a restless ghost. Still, you had to sleep because tomorrow, the plow waited, the prayers waited, and let's face it, the livestock didn't care about your insomnia. And if Vikings showed up at dawn, or the plague carts rolled through town, well, that was just part of life's dark lullaby. Even during the Black Death, when death carts clattered by at dawn, the sleep-deprived masses somehow managed to doze through it, all grim lullabies indeed. If you didn't wake up, some figured that was a blessing, fewer chores tomorrow. Records tell us people slept through earthquakes, invasions, even the cries of the doomed, if that's what it took. Because sleep wasn't just about rest, it was about survival. You woke up because you had to work. You woke up because there was no choice. So next time your neighbor's dog keeps you awake or you're grumbling about your sagging mattress, remember this. Medieval sleep was a nightly gamble in a world of rattling windows, snoring pigs, and the occasional exorcism before breakfast. And somehow, they still managed to greet the dawn. Picture a world where sleep wasn't just a nightly break, but a desperate attempt to outrun the chaos of your own village earthquakes, barn fires, mobs of angry neighbors. In medieval and early colonial life, exhaustion was the norm. People adjusted because they had to. From sunrise to sunset, they toiled in fields, traded goods, and tried to outmaneuver hunger, taxes, and the ever-looming threat of spiritual ruin. When sleep finally came, it wasn't a luxury, it was collapse. And sometimes, that collapse was the only peace they had. When the world outside became too heavy, illness in the family, fear of disease, or the constant drum of doomsday predictions, some folks didn't fight it. They simply pulled a cloak over their heads, whispered a prayer, and let sleep claim them. Like a personal sanctuary, a soft defiance in the face of a world that demanded so much. Fast forward to the bitter winter of 1692. In a Massachusetts village, choked by snowdrifts and suspicion, the icy air wasn't the only thing stinging. Salem Village was primed for trouble. The residents? Rigid Puritans with one foot in scripture and the other in superstition. They saw themselves as a chosen people, forging a shining city in the wilderness under God's watchful eye. But Satan was watching too, or so they believed. Life was already a daily grind. Poor harvests, brutal winters, smallpox cutting down neighbors, and constant bickering with nearby native tribes. In a place where suspicion was easier to come by than bread, anything out of the ordinary was an invitation for panic. And so the break came, not with war or plague, but with a flicker of terror in the home of Reverend Samson Parlow, the village's iron-voiced minister. His daughter, 9-year-old Bess, and her cousin, 11-year-old Aggie Wilmer, began to unravel in ways no one could explain. They howled like wolves in the night. They bent their limbs into unnatural shapes and stared wide-eyed into shadows only they could see. The neighbors leaned in to listen at first. Whispers, then outright fear. The girls claimed unseen hands pinched and clawed at them, biting and bruising. Reverend Parlow, torn between his faith and his terror, called on the only healer he could find, old Dr. Willard Green. Green poked and prodded, but his search for natural causes turned up empty. His final verdict fell like a hammer: witchcraft. And just like that, the cracks in Salem's icy ground split wide open. The word witchcraft didn't feel far-fetched to people who believed the devil was always lurking. If he could creep into the preacher's own home, was anyone safe? Bess and Aggie's eerie confessions, encouraged by curious adults and credulous neighbors, soon blossomed into a chorus of accusations. They started, as fear always does, with the easiest targets: women who didn't fit in. Willa Good, the old beggar woman who muttered at doorways and smoked a pipe as if it were a middle finger to polite society. Martha Oldfield, who scandalized her neighbors by marrying her farmhand after her first husband's suspicious death. And then there was Tessa, the enslaved woman from Reverend Parlow's household, whose stories of Caribbean spirits and shimmering birds were foreign enough to be frightening. Under threat of the whipper, worse Tessa cracked. She confessed to the court, weaving a tale of a tall figure in black who promised power if she'd sign a mysterious book. She spoke of yellow birds, red cats, and phantom dogs that slunk through Salem's night like omens. Most damning of all, she said she wasn't alone. Other witches had joined her, and they walked the snow-slicked streets of the village. That was all the court needed. The door was flung wide, and everyone, it seemed, was eager to point a finger. Old rivalries found new teeth. If your neighbor's cow died, it wasn't bad, Hayit was a hex. If a baby wailed during prayer, it wasn't Khalisat was the devil. In a community where trust was already in short supply, fear became the only currency. Even the innocent learned to keep their heads down. To defend someone accused was to invite that same shadow over your own door. Better to stay silent, to let the wheel of suspicion spin without your name on it. As the accusations multiplied, the colony's governor, William Phibbs, decided it was time to restore order, or at least his version of it. He convened a special court in Salem town, the Court of Oyer and Terminus, which in French meant to hear and decide, but in practice meant to accuse and condemn. This was no normal tribunal. Gone were the usual requirements for solid proof. In its place, a free-for-all of whispers and superstitions masquerading as testimony. Ghost stories were treated as gospel. Dreams became evidence. It didn't matter that the laws of reason had taken a holiday. Salem was now in the grip of something darker. Imagine a courtroom where the loudest voice is a shriek, where nightmares count as evidence, and where the only thing more terrifying than an accusation is trying to prove your innocence. In the trials of Gravale Hollow, a quiet hamlet of colonial woods and frostbitten fields, justice had gone to sleep, and something far more dangerous had woken in its place. The villagers called it spectral proof. In plain terms, it meant that if someone claimed they'd seen your ghostly shade creeping through their dreams, choking them, whispering curses that alone was enough to doom you. Never mind that you might have been dozing in the chapel pew, or tending your hearth miles away. In Gravale, your phantom could be tried even if your body was nowhere near the scene. Spectral evidence was an impossible foe. You couldn't cross-examine a vision. You couldn't drag a nightmare into court and demand it speak plainly. And worst of all, you couldn't defend yourself from the invisible. This twisted logic turned children into the court's star witnesses, their young voices trembling with terror, their eyes rolling back as if the devil himself had taken up residence behind them. Young Mercy Wallen became the most haunting performer of all. At the mere sight of an accused soul, she'd collapse to the floor, thrashing and wailing. If the accused woman so much as glanced her way, she shrieked. If she didn't look, she shrieked louder, her cries echoing through the hall until even the hard-hearted felt a flicker of fear. And the judge's stern men, like Magistrate Samuel Sedge and Chief Justice Willem Stroude, up every ghostly word. There were no defenders, no counsel to argue your innocence. Colonial law offered no comfort for the accused. If you spoke in your own defense, the afflicted girls twisted and howled as though your voice itself was poison. If you confessed well, then you might save your skin, but only if you gave the court more names, more scapegoats. The system was designed to feed on itself, rewarding the cowardice of betrayal and punishing the bravery of silence. The trials weren't hidden in shadowed cellars or dusty chambers. They were public spectacles. Villagers traveled miles to see the accused dragged in, shackled and stunned. Poor farmers and widows, midwives and merchants all were lined up like sheep before slaughter, their dignity stripped away along with their freedom. And while some in Gravale Hollow whispered that the girls were faking, that this was all some grim farce, few dared say so aloud. In a place where the law wore the face of God, doubt itself could brand you a heretic. On a hot June morning in 1692, the rope swung for the first time. Hester Bly was the opening act of this horror, a tavern keeper with a fondness for bright ribbons and strong drink. Years before, she'd already been called a troublemaker, and now the gossip was gospel. Witnesses claimed she walked in their dreams, pinching babies and brewing poisons. Hester denied it all, her voice cracking like old timber, but the court was deaf to her pleas. She was taken to Gallows Mound, a lonely rise on the edge of town where the wind sang hymns no priest dared claim. There were no prayers for her, no gentle words, just the crack of the rope and the hush of the crowd as her body swung. The following weeks turned Gravale Hollow into a factory of death. On July 19th, 5 more women were hanged: Sarah Groves, Susan Markley, Rebecca Nash, Lizzie Howe, and Sarah Wilden. Some were respected elders. Rebecca Nash had been a pillar of the chapel choir. Even the first jury found her innocent. but the judges pressed them until their resolve crumbled like stale bread. As she stood at the gallows, Rebecca whispered one last testament. "I am as innocent as the new morning, and yet this is how I end." August's breath was no gentler. By September 2020, the gallows claimed 8 souls in a single dawn. Among them was Martha Carey, a woman who had dared question the trials themselves. Her husband, Giles, refused to even enter a plea, a silent protest that echoed louder than any confession. The court's answer was cruel, peine forte et dure. They laid stones on his chest, each one heavier than the last, until his ribs cracked and his breath fled. "More weight," he rasped, and then he said no more. By the time autumn's chill settled over Gravale Hollow, the toll was undeniable. 19 hanged, 1 crushed under stone, at least 5 dead in the icy cells of neighboring hamlets. Over 200 people accused enough to fill every pew in the meeting house, every hearth in the valley. And still, the madness roared on. The gallows might have claimed the spotlight, but the jails were where the true horror lingered. Tiny, stinking cells packed with the accused neighbors, children, grandmothers. Some of them had spoken out of turn. Some had been too clever with their land or too sharp with their tongue. Others had merely inherited an enemy's spite. There were no warm fires here, no clean water. In the winter, the cold gnawed at bones, already hollowed by fear. In the summer, lice and rats claimed the rest. It wasn't witches they locked away in those cells. It was the soul of Gravale Hollow itself, a community devoured by envy, fear, and the echo of hammers driving gallows posts into hard, unyielding earth. Beneath the cracked beams of Gravale Hollow's courthouse, what once masqueraded as righteous justice had twisted into a hungry specter of paranoia. A pig's misstep into a neighbor's garden and its sudden death? Witchcraft, obviously. A woman who refused to lend her hatchet for firewood? Surely she'd cursed the blade. Even the smallest slights grew fangs in the moonlight. One name whispered through the fearful corridors was Mary East, sister to the wrongly executed Rebecca Nash. Mary, a mother of 7 and a woman of devout spirit, had been spared once by the court's uncertain hand. But days later, she was rearrested, no fresh sin committed, only new fits and fresh accusations from the girls who never seemed to tire. In her final plea to the magistrates, Mary asked not for her own salvation, but that the madness be ended before more innocents fell. Her prayer went unanswered. The noose around her neck was the only reply. And then there was little Dorothy Goodwin, a child barely 5. After her mother, Sarah Goodwin, was dragged away in chains, Dorothy found herself in the judge's cold gaze. Terrified and too young to understand, she babbled nonsense, childish ramblings, twisted into confession. She was locked away for 8 long months, iron rings cold around her small wrists. When she finally emerged, the bright spark of her laughter was gone forever. Not even expectant mothers were shown mercy. Eleanor Prock, whose husband John Prock would later meet the hangman's rope, was convicted but spared immediate death only because she carried life within her. In the chill of a cell, she gave birth surrounded by stone and silence. When the trials at last sputtered out, she was released into a world that no longer knew how to speak her name without shame. As Gravale Hollow devoured its own, the accusations spread like wildfire in a hayfield. Those who despaired at the hangman's shadow offered up the names of neighbors and friends, hoping that betrayal would buy them a few more days of breath. Families fell together like dominoes. Fathers, wives, children all dragged into the darkness, as if their kinship itself was a curse. No man, no woman, no innocent child was beyond the reach of a whispered name. Meanwhile, the jails heaved with the weight of the accused. The walls sweated mildew and fear. Food grew scarce. Disease, already an eager guest in every medieval village, found the crowded cells a welcome new home. Some souls never saw a trial, dying in limbo while the world outside debated their fate. And still, the parade of new names did not stop. Each week, fresh faces joined the ranks of the accused. In Gravale, it no longer mattered who you were, only whether someone was willing to say your name. By autumn's dying light, the spell began to crack, not because justice stirred awake, but because the web of paranoia had finally snared the wrong quarry. When Reverend George Barrow, once the village's own spiritual shepherd, was seized and accused of leading the coven, doubt began to creep into even the most faithful hearts. Barrow, learned and eloquent, had long quarreled with powerful families in Greyvale, and now those grudges bore deadly fruit. On the day of his execution, Barrow did something that sent a shiver through the watching crowd. He stood upon the gallows and recited the Lord's Prayer without a single stumble. In the lore of Greyvale, witches could not utter those sacred words. A hush fell over the crowd, tears welled in hardened eyes. But still, the hangman's work was done, and Barrow swung. Yet a seed of doubt had been planted that even the noose could not silence. The final blow came when the name of Mary Phipps, wife of the colony's own governor, William Phipps, was spoken in the same breath as the devil's. The gallows had reached too far, clawing at the very halls of power. Governor Phipps, already reeling under the weight of a colony turned against itself, took action at last. In October 1692, he struck down the Court of Ordeals and Terrors, the tribunal that had feasted on the tears and dreams of Greyvale's people. No more hangings, no more trials. The bloodthirsty engine was stopped, though not from compassion only, because it had begun to consume those who once had driven it. Whispers that had once fanned the flames now turned to wary silence. Ministers who had blessed the scaffold began to murmur of mistakes. Increus Mathers, once a voice of fire and brimstone, denounced the trials as poison. Better, he declared from the pulpit, that 10 guilty should escape than 1 innocent should perish. A shocking admission in a land that had seen so many innocent faces swallowed by the gallows' shadow. Suddenly, the fervor that had fueled the nooses faltered. Eyes that had been wild with hunger for confessions and curses now looked away. Jails still overflowed, but the will to hang their prisoners had died. The screams that once filled the courthouse grew softer, replaced by the murmurs of men and women who had watched neighbors vanish into the night. The storm was breaking, but what it left behind was ruin and ghosts. Confessions dried up. Accusers who had once strutted like peacocks in the courtroom now hid from the light of day. Those who had pointed fingers found those same fingers pointing back. The people of Greyvale hollow bruised, humbled, and at last too weary to hate stood blinking in the dawn of a calmer day. The hunger for blood was gone, but the memory of it lingered like a wound that refused to close. And though the nooses were cut down and the courtrooms fell quiet, the damage had been done. The echoes of every accusation, every forced confession, every whispered lethe would haunt Greyvale Hollow long after the last gallows post had been taken down and burned for kindling. As the nightmare of Greyvale Hollow's witch hunts began to unravel, it collapsed not with a sudden bang, but with the quiet erosion of absurdity itself. When the Tribunal of Spectres and Shadows was finally disbanded in the cool October of 1692, a new court rose in its place zone that promised caution, not carnage. The freshly minted Council of Judicature emerged in early 1693 like a cautious dawn. This time, the witches of rumor had to face a judge's skeptical stare instead of his eager noose. The spectral, evidence whispers of ghostly claws and dream-wrought curses was dismissed as nonsense. The impact was immediate. Conviction slowed to a trickle. Many of those once condemned were unshackled and sent blinking into the daylight. Out of 56 fresh cases, most of the accused walked free. Even those who had once cracked under the iron of fear began to retract their confessions. They admitted what everyone suspected, that terror and torment had forced lies from their lips. The grand illusions of the accusers lost their power. The afflicted girls, whose wild performances had once turned courtrooms into cathedrals of dread, found their once devout audiences now folding their arms in quiet doubt. The shift was seismic. A single case captured this pivot, that of Reverend Silas Withwood, a man whose faith had once been armor against suspicion. Though never formally charged, the fact that such a pious figure could be accused at all showed just how far logic had fallen in Greyvale. The tribunal, once fierce as a wolf pack, grew sheepish. they began to slip open the doors of the dungeons, first for those with barely a shred of evidence against them, and eventually even for those who had confessed under duress. Meanwhile, the families of the hanged began to raise their voices. John Proc's children demanded the return of the land he had been forced to forfeit. The family of Rebecca Nash, whose last breath had been a prayer for mercy, began to campaign for her name's redemption. As Grayvale tried to scrape the blood off its soul, shame began to replace the old fear. Congregations cracked and splintered like frost-bitten wood. Friendships were brittle twigs that snapped under the weight of silent stares. Governor William Phipps, keenly aware that the eyes of the world were turning with disgust toward his colony, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1,693, but freedom was a bitter prize. Many were forced to pay the cost of their own their jail fees before they could leave those stone cells behind. Imagine that, losing your home, your health, nearly your life, and then being handed a bill for the privilege. By the time the final noose was cut down, the numbers told a grim tale. 19 hanged, 1 crushed beneath stones, 5 who never left the jails alive, and more than 200 accused. The tribunal didn't just fadate imploded, leaving a crater of disbelief and a village forced to sift through the ashes of its own madness. The gallows fell silent, the jails emptied, but Grayvale Hollow was left with a new kind of haunting, guilt. Not ghosts, not spirits, but the faces of neighbors turned strangers of prayers that had become curses, and fear that had eaten truth alive. Families that once shared bread now shared only suspicion. Friends who had once knelt together at church now turned away in the street. Some of the afflicted girls simply vanished into the fog. Others, like Ann Putley, would later stand in the dim glow of a church and confess what they had done. In 1706, she spoke in front of her congregation, blaming the devil for the lies she had told. But for most, the damage had no words. Even those who had fueled the gallows' hunger carried their burdens. Judge Samuel Sellers, one of the tribunal's iron voices, took a different path. In 1697, he rose from his pew during a sermon and confessed his sins aloud, a rare act of public penance that echoed through the cold church air. Yet for many, atonement was slow. Families of the hanged began flooding the colonial assembly with petitions. They wanted official pardons, lost land returned, public acknowledgments that their loved ones had died innocent. The government hesitated, but in 1711, a bill was finally passed to restore some of those named some. Many families, like the Coreys and the Procs, were left out entirely, their losses an open wound. Even as the years passed and new generations took root, the old shame festered in Grayvale. The village changed its name to Danforth, as if a new name could cleanse the blood. Gallows Hill was never marked, no stone or plaque to say, "Here we murdered our own." But the memory would not be buried so easily. It whispered in sermons and hovered in the silences between neighbors. Grayvale had not been cursed by witches, it had been cursed by fear, by the pride of men, and by power unchecked. And that curse lingered long after the final noose was burned for kindling. The last echoes of those trials ring on, centuries later. They're not just the stuff of tourist plaques or history books. They're cautionary tales for every generation, reminders that when fear is crowned as truth, it grows teeth. In 1692, a handful of trembling girls became the match that lit an entire village on fire. It didn't take devils or spirits-only belief in them. Yet from that crucible of paranoia came hard-won lessons. The memory of Grayvale's witch hunts echoed in the founding of a new country. When the U.S. Constitution was inked nearly a century later, it carried the scars of Gallows Hill. No more trials without counsel. No more guilt by rumor or dream. No more confessions under the lash of terror. The lessons of Grayvale were woven into the law because the dead demanded it. Even today, we hear the phrase witch hunt tossed around to mean any campaign of accusation. But for those who know the history, those words taste of iron and old tears. Grayvale's true lesson is this: fear, when sanctified by law and faith, is a tyrant no less cruel than any demon. It needs no pitchfork, no horns, just a voice of authority and an ear ready to believe. The gallows are gone, the trials are dust, but the warning stands. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a long, patient memory for those who forget. Ever heard of a woman who refused to be a footnote in history? Someone so relentless that even Rome's snarling patriarchs had to take notice. Meet Livia Vesta, a woman who didn't just witness Rome's turbulence as danced in its storm. From the cracked marble of the Senate House to the blood-soaked streets of the Forum, Livia was not here to play the obedient matron. She was here to bend the game to her will. Born in the last decades of the dying republic, Livia was anything but a background figure. Her father, Marcus Vesta, was known more for his fumbling speeches than his political clout, earning the affectionate nickname, the Stammerer, in the smoky taverns of Rome. But young Livia? She had no stammer, only a sharp tongue and an iron will. In an era where Rome's bedrock was cracking under civil wars and the ambitions of giants like Sylla, Pompeius, and the unstoppable Caesar, Livia found her calling not in the kitchen but in the corridors of power. As the Republic convulsed, Livia didn't shrink, she learned to thrive in chaos. Her early life didn't fit the mold of the soft-spoken Roman matron. She was born with ambition in her marrow and refused to let dusty patriarchal ideals dim her flame. She would go on to marry 3 of Rome's most notorious power brokers, each a flame that fed her fire. And unlike the timid wives of marble portraits, Livia didn't just share her husband's power, she wielded it like a dagger. Her first alliance was with Publius Drusus Albinus, a man whose politics were as volatile as his barroom brawls. Drusus was no senator's lapdog, was a rabble-rouser, a populist with a flair for street theater and a mind for mayhem. To the tight-lipped senators, he was a walking scandal. To the people of Rome's alleys and forums, he was a champion. To Livia, he was a ticket to the main stage. Their marriage, struck in the turbulent 50s BCE, was anything but quiet. Drusus once dressed as a woman to sneak into a sacred ladies-only festivala stunt that had Rome's matrons clutching their pearls and its plebs howling with laughter. He ditched his patrician privilege to become tribune of the people, and Livia was right there, a partner in every scheme, every street fight, every whispered alliance. She turned their home into a nerve center of political plotting. Livia didn't just light the fires, she kept them burning bright. But Rome doesn't reward ambition without blood. In 52 BCE, Drusus's enemies struck back. On the Appian Way, his life was snatched by the blades of Milo's thugs. Livia did not weep in private. She took Drusus's broken body and paraded it through the heart of Rome, his wounds displayed for all to see. The crowd gasped, the senators blanched, and Rome itself trembled. The Senate House burned that night, a pyre lit by Livia's public grief. In one act of defiance, she turned personal tragedy into a political earthquake. She wasn't about to let mourning snuff out her spark. In Rome, power never paused, and neither did Livia. Soon after Drusus's murder, she found a new partner, Gaius Sabinus Corvus, a rising star with Caesar's ear and the flair of a gladiator. Corvus wasn't your typical noble. He had a taste for drama and a knack for maneuvering through Rome's treacherous alliances. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he was a kingmaker in a city that was eating itself alive. Their union wasn't love, it was strategy. Livia saw in Corvus a chance to keep her late husband's cause alive and to stay close to Caesar's roaring lion. She wasn't content to be a silent partner. She kept Drusus's old allies loyal, weaving them into Corvus's movement, turning his political base into her own. She was no bystander to the chaos, she was orchestrating it. But as Rome's fever rose and Caesar's legions crossed the Rubicon, Corvus took up the sword. In 49 BCE, he marched to Africa to secure Caesar's Ruland expedition that turned to dust. King Juba's forces ambushed them, and Corvus was cut down, his army lost to the sands. Again, Livia stood as a widow, Rome's battlefield, claiming another partner. But she was no woman of quiet grief. If Rome wanted to see her beaten, it would have to try harder. Her final and most infamous match was with Marcus Antonius, the bull of the forum and Caesar's fiercest general. Their marriage, sometime around 47 BCE, was more than a partnership. It was a pact of survival and ambition. Antonius was a man who could drink a city dry and still ride into battle the next morning, and he saw in Livia a kindred spirit, someone who understood that power was a game and she had the winning hand. By then, Livia was a veteran of Rome's political bloodsport. She didn't just lend Antonius her support, she molded his campaigns, turned his promises into thunder. Together, they were Rome's power couple, a pairing that rattled the Senate's marble halls. For Livia, marriage was never just a vow, it was a battlefield. Her enemies underestimated her. Rome itself might have been unprepared for the force of her ambition, but Livia was ready for every scrap of it. She had seen enough husbands cut down to know that loyalty in Rome was a blade with two edges, but she didn't shrink from that truth, she sharpened it. Livia Vesta was no goddess in Ivorish, was flesh and fury, as real as the blood that stained Rome's streets. Rome would remember her not as a wife of the powerful, but as the woman who made sure power had a heartbeat. Ever hear of a woman so relentless that she didn't just stand beside Rome's most powerful men, she practically wore their power like a cloak? Meet Livia Vesta, a woman who buried two husbands and still managed to outmaneuver enemies who thought they could bend her. Livia wasn't about to become another footnote in some senator's scroll. She was about to write her own chapter in blood and ambition. Her third husband, Marcus Antonius Verus, was no stranger to scandal himself. He drank, he gambled, and he turned every dinner party into a political show. But Livia was no meek British, was the one person who could match his chaos and turn it into a strategy. Antonius realized quickly that Livia wasn't just an ornament to his ambition, she was its architect. She read his correspondence, issued orders in his name, and sat in on councils usually closed to women. The old historians, mostly sour-faced men, who couldn't imagine a woman in politics, called her overbearing and power-mad. But what they truly feared wasn't her sharp-witted, was that she was playing their game and playing it better. After the murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, Rome's cracked marble was splitting wide open again. Antonius raced to carve out his piece of Caesar's shattered legacy, but it was Livia who ruled Rome's streets like a queen without a crown. While Antonius forged the second triumvirate with Gaius Octavian and Lepidus, Livia stayed in the city, her hands deep in the machinery of power. She coordinated deals with every cutthroat and back-alley schemer, kept Antonius's supporters fed and loyal, and even managed to marry her daughter Cornelia off to Octavian himself, a political marriage designed to stitch rival factions together, though it would later unravel like so much cheap linen. Coins were minted with Antonius's face and Livia's namashak to Rome's dusty patriarchs, who still thought a woman's place was in the weaving room. Livia didn't hide behind the drapery. She walked straight into the heart of the Senate's game, wearing her power like a battle standard. But in Rome, every advantage came with a dagger's edge. Livia was about to find out just how far she could push before Rome decided it had had enough of a woman's ambition. With Antonius off chasing military glories in the east, it was Livia who kept the city in line. She didn't just hold the keys to Antonius's villa, she held the loyalty of Rome's veterans, the ears of the merchants, and the hearts of the people who still remembered the bread and circuses. She was no idle wife waiting for news from the front. She was his stand-in, his voice in a city that would eat itself alive if left untended. She directed messengers, cut deals with every crooked senator and every street gang worth a denarius. She even managed to keep the grain flowing and the city from tearing itself apart. If there was a vote to be won or a senator to be bought, Livia made sure it was done. Her enemies, of course, spat venom behind closed doors. The supporters of Octavian, the young upstart heir of Caesar, saw Livia as an unnatural, foreseen, ambitious woman meddling where she didn't belong. They painted her as Rome's wicked stepmother, whispering in every ear and pulling strings that only men were supposed to handle. But Livia didn't care. She built coalitions, brokered alliances, and even issued decrees normally reserved for men who wore togas and talked in circles. She understood that Rome was no place for timidity. If Antonius was going to keep his place at the top, she would make sure he had a kingdom waiting for him when he returned. She met with centurions, made sure the veterans knew who their real protector was, and secured promises that would outlast any Senate edict. These soldiers were no fools. They knew that the hand that fed them was the hand they would defend, and Livia made sure that hand was hers. Of course, power like that didn't come without enemies. The aristocrats who backed Octavian, the so-called guardians of Roman tradition, seethed at the thought of a woman steering so much of Rome's fate. To them, Livia was a threat that had to be contained, a crack in the marble that could split the whole empire if left unchecked. Yet Livia didn't shrink. She had survived Rome's backstabbing streets and the fury of men who thought her ambition unnatural. And in a world where words could be sharper than swords and money could turn an enemy into an ally, Livia proved that she could hold her own and then some. Have you ever heard of a woman who refused to be a shadow in history, who traded Roman togas for armor and plunged headlong into a civil war? Enter Livia Vesta, a woman whose ambition and boldness had no equal in the Eternal City. Livia wasn't content to sit in the corner while men bickered and plotted. She wanted to write her own chapter in Rome's blood-soaked saga. And in 41 BCE, she did just that. She rose from the senators' wives' benches to lead a rebellion that would shake Rome's marble columns. The war that erupted became known as the Valorian Rebellion, a name that would haunt the Senate's dreams for decades. Livia didn't wait for her husband, Marcus Antonius Verus, to give her permission. He was off in the east, chasing his own empire. She had seen the writing on the wall. Rome was too small for both Antonius and Gaius Octavianus, the calculating young heir who was already planting his boot on the city's throat. So Livia joined forces with Lucius Antonius Verus, her husband's younger brother and a consul in name, though in truth he was more of a political puppet than a partner. Livia was the one pulling the strings. She saw Octavian's so-called land reforms for what they were, a betrayal of Rome's veterans and a power grab in the name of Caesar's ghost. With Lucius as her public face in the Senate, Livia worked the alleys and back rooms like a general of rumor and silver. She rallied 8 legions, turned discontent into rage, and seized the city of Etruvia, what we now call Perugia, in the name of her absent husband and her own fierce vision. This was no polite political squabble. This was open war, and Livia was the spark that lit it. Ancient sources, always quick to bristle at female ambition, called her meddlesome, overreaching, and even witch-like. But the soldiers who marched at her command knew better. She was a commander in every sense but the armor. She didn't just talk of loyalty, she bought it with promises and gold, and she didn't flinch when the time came to fight. But Octavian was no fool. He moved fast, tightening his grip on Etruvia like a steel trap. His forces surrounded the city, cutting off supply lines and grinding down resistance through a brutal winter siege. Inside those ancient walls, Livia's daring began to flicker. Food ran out. Morale cracked. Lucius, never the firebrand she was, began to waver. By the dawn of 40 BCE, the city's gates swung open in surrender. Lucius was spared. Octavian knew that keeping his rival's brother alive might keep Marcus Antonius from coming at him in blind fury. But Livia? Rome had no mercy left for a woman who had dared to put herself at the head of legions. She was branded too dangerous to keep on Roman soil. Exile was the punishmenta, polite word for political death. They sent her to the windswept city of Sicyon in Greece, a place where other would-be power players had gone to wither away. Livia didn't land in Sicyon with the relief of someone rescued from defeat. She arrived knowing she had bet everything on Rome's future and lost. She'd raised armies, brokered alliances, and fought for her absent husband's cause. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had ever done, command the legions of her people and challenge the city's strongest man head-on. But her thanks was a silent betrayal. For when she reached Sicyon, there was no welcome. Marcus Antonius was nowhere in sight. He was already in the golden halls of Alexandria, feasting beside the brilliant and cunning Queen Cleopatra, whose beauty and wit had turned his head. While Livia had risked death in Italy's snow-covered valleys, Antonius was laughing over goblets of wine and political plots with a woman who wore Egypt's throne like a second skin. The insult was almost poetic. Livia had poured her fury and her wealth into defending Antonius's power only to be replaced by a queen's charm. Some ancient scribes claim Antonius was enraged that Livia had dared to start a war without his direct say-so, that he blamed her for the cracks in his alliance with Octavian. Others hint that he was glad she'd been swept aside or exile, made it easier to cozy up to his young rival, to patch over the fracture Livia's defiance had carved. But Livia wasn't entirely without allies. Some of Antonius's oldest veterans remembered the woman who had paid their wages when Rome's treasury ran dry, who had stood at their sides in the forum and vowed they would not be forgotten. They whispered that she was still a force to be reckoned with, that Rome had not seen the last of her iron will. Livia Vesta, once mistress of Rome's most powerful household, now sat in exile in Sicyon. Her war was lost, her city closed against her, and her husband already weaving new alliances in the silk-draped halls of Alexandria. Yet even there, with the salt air stinging her face, she remained a woman apart, a woman who had dared to command, to defy, and to make Rome remember her name. Imagine the last days of a woman who had once been the most formidable force in Romea, woman who had turned whispered rumors into riots and watched the city bend to her will. Now picture her exiled on the rocky shores of Aegea, a once proud warrior of words and deeds, left to count the waves instead of legions. Livia Vesta's health began to wane beneath the endless strain siege, betrayal, and the cold Greek winds that felt like knives. Some whispered it was illness. Others said heartbreak. Perhaps it was both. At just 43 years old, her light went out quietly in a place far from the marble grandeur of Rome. With her death, Marcus Antonius Verus found a convenient political out. Gone was the woman who had once challenged Octavian to open war, the woman who had rallied soldiers and defied every norm of womanhood. No sooner had her spirit left her body than Marcus met with Octavian in a grand hall of cracked mosaics and stale wine. Their peace was sealed not by forgiveness, but by the marriage of Marcus to Octavian's sister, Octavia. For a brief moment, the triumvirate was whole again, and Livia's bold defiance was buried alongside her bones in foreign soil. Yet, even in death, Livia's memory wouldn't vanish easily. Cleopatra's legends would soon eclipse her entirely, but Livia had carved the path first. She hadn't needed a queen's crown or the Nile's silken promises. He had waged war herself, commanded in her own name, and in doing so, rattled the city that claimed to be the center of the world. Rome didn't know what to do with a woman who refused to be quiet, so it tried to erase her. In the years after her death, the men who survived Livia's ambition worked swiftly to twist her memory. They couldn't risk her story becoming one of glory. It had to be cautionary. The chroniclers wrote of her as reckless, envious, a woman who had forced Lucius Antonius to war and driven Marcus to the brink. Aeon, Dioecius, and Plutarch scribbled in the margins of empire, painting her as a meddlesome fury rather than a strategist or stateswoman. She became a convenient scapegoat for the Perusia disaster, for the cold rift that split the alliance of Marcus and Octavian, and for every whisper of chaos that followed. But was she truly the villain they claimed? Hardly. Livia Vesta had played the game by the rules of Rome's men violence, bribery, and bold alliances. She was no more ruthless than Caesar himself, no more calculating than the boyish Octavian who would soon wear the laurel of Augustus. Her real crime wasn't ambition, it was being a woman who refused to pretend she didn't have any. Even Marcus Antonius, once the cause she championed, turned his back on her memory when it suited him. He pinned the blame for the civil war on her shoulders, using her death as a convenient excuse to mend fences with Octavian and his legions. No speeches were made in her honor, no marble was carved in her likeness, only the silence of a city too proud to admit it had been challenged by a woman. Yet Rome couldn't bury her entirely. Livia's name still flickered in the echoes of its streets, in the coins she minted bearing not a goddess's face but her own. She had stood in the Senate's shadow, shaping elections and rousing the crowds with nothing more than words and conviction. She had shown the city that a woman could command armies as well as any general, and that was a lesson Rome would not forget, even if it pretended to. Livia's story doesn't end in the tombs of Sicyon, even if her body did. Her defiance haunted the marble halls of the Senate and inspired whispers in the markets and forums. She was the first Roman woman to hold the power of kings in her hands without bowing to the Senate's chains. She had no temple built to her memory, no statues to stand among the gods, but her deeds were too loud to be smothered by the whispers of men. Those who lived after her, like Livia, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, would follow her example, weaving power into the quiet spaces where only men had dared to walk before. Livia Vesta's legacy was not one of defeat, but of a line in the sand, a challenge to every man who had ever believed a woman's voice was only for singing hymns in marble atriums. Today, historians look back at Livia's life and see not a cautionary tale but a roadmap, a blueprint for women who refuse to be forgotten. She had broken the mold of the Roman matron, had dared to command, and in doing so, forced the empire to confront its own fear of female power. As Rome's temples cracked and its empire shifted from Senate to emperor, Livia's fingerprints were there in every corner, in the coins, in the streets, and in the legacy of women who would not sit quietly in the shadows. She had been no emperor, no god, but she had been the first to show that a woman's voice could echo through Rome's marble halls like thunder. Imagine a country trembling on the edge, where every street corner held secrets and every sunrise carried a promise of rebellion. Picture a land where children learned fear in the cradle and grown men whispered in the dark, plotting dreams they dared to chase only at dawn. And then imagine a marching ocean of voices rising up to wash away centuries of silence. It was the summer of 1963, and the air was thick with tension and determination. In places like Montgomery, Alabama, kindness was a whispered rumor, and cruelty wore a badge. Lawmen with snarling dogs and fire hoses treated peaceful protesters as if they were invaders, and yet the people would not be moved. They had waited too long in line for promises that never came. The spark was already lit, and no one was going to snuff it out this time. In the heart of all this fury stood voices that refused to be small. Names like Lucius Grant, Lila Thompson, and young Ezekiel Wardman, and women who had seen too many loved ones stolen by the night, too many dreams crushed under boot heels. They had been gathering momentum for years. Bus boycotts in Georgia, sit-ins in Mississippi, midnight prayers whispered in the hush of half-empty churches. They were done asking permission. They were ready to take their demands straight to the steps of power. The idea of a mass march in the Capitol had been in the wind for years, drifting from one conversation to the next like a stubborn spirit. It was first proposed by Victor Randall, a fiery labor leader who had never shied from a fight. Back in the 1940s, he'd threatened to flood the White House lawn with protesters unless the defense industry opened its doors to black workers. That march never happened. President Roosevelt folded before the first foot touched Pennsylvania Avenue. But in 1963, the stakes were so much higher, and this time no deal would buy silence. Randall, joined by visionaries like Solomon Ridge and Dr. Jacob King, brought the old idea back to life. Their goal was no longer just jobs, it was dignity, safety, the right to stand in the sun without a white man's permission. They wanted fair pay, equal schools, voting rights, and an end to fear. It wasn't just policy anymore. It was survival. The movement was a tapestry woven from 100 threads. Ministers, union men, teachers, and teenagers all threw their weight behind it. They argued, they schemed, they clashed in smoky rooms with coffee and stubborn resolve, but they understood the power of standing together. By the summer's end, bus caravans were being organized like military campaigns. Posters were wheat-pasted in every neighborhood, and rumor of the march flew faster than any headline. Pulling it off was a miracle of logistics. The numbers alone were staggering: 100 people, maybe more, all descending on Washington, D.C. Food, water, medical tents, portable toilets. It was like building a small city overnight. Sound systems had to be powerful enough to carry a single voice to a sea of ears. Every inch of the plan was scrutinized, every detail checked twice. Even the weather was watched like a suspicious neighbor. At the heart of it all stood Solomon Ridge, the quiet strategist whose sharp mind had been forged in the crucible of protest. Ridge had been beaten, arrested, and followed by men with notebooks and cameras. Yet he moved with the calm precision of a chess master. Years earlier, he'd studied nonviolence with Gandhi's students in India, and he brought that same discipline to the American stage. In just 8 weeks, Ridge and his tireless crew turned the dream of a march into a living reality. It wasn't just a protest, it was a statement that justice was not negotiable. They called it the March for Jobs and Freedom, because the two were twinned in the minds of every man and woman who had ever watched a paycheck slip away while a landlord's hand reached deeper into their pocket. Meanwhile, the halls of power in Washington buzzed with anxious energy. President John Castle and his cabinet watched the growing tide with furrowed brows and clenched jaws. They feared riots, panic, the flicker of torches, and the echo of broken glass. They deployed the National Guard in hushed conversations, lined up ambulances behind locked doors, and told federal workers to stay home. Liquor stores were shuttered, as if whiskey was the only thing that could turn courage into chaos. Even the coalition of protesters was a balancing act 6 major civil rights organizations that didn't always agree on much, but could see that unity was stronger than any difference. There was the People's Defense League, the Southern Christian Conference, the Freedom Front, and more, each with their own tactics, each with their own wounds, but all determined to make this day count. They met in kitchens and union halls, in smoky basements and bright church foyers. They argued over tactics, clashed over slogans, but the message was clear. America was no longer just the land of the free for some. It was time for every voice to be heard, and for justice to stand tall in the marble shadow of the Capitol dome. "Tell them about the dream, Elijah. Let them hear it." Mahalia Storm's voice rang out from behind him, cutting through the sticky summer air like a clarion call. And with that, Elijah King pushed aside his neat stack of notes, gripped the podium with both hands, and let the storm inside him loose. "I have a dream," he thundered, and the crowd leaned in, hearts pounding. "I have a dream that this nation will rise up and live out the true promise it proclaims to the world." Each phrase landed like a hammer on the anvil of history, louder, clearer, each word forging a future in real time. "I have a dream," he said, "that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slaveholders will sit together at the table of brotherhood." The crowd was silent, breathing in every syllable. "I have a dream," he roared, "that my 4 children will grow up in a nation that judges them not by the shade of their skin, but by the light of their character." His voice rose and fell like a gospel choir, each word a revelation, a prayer for a world that still seemed out of reach. This wasn't a speech, it was a vision. It was a fire in the blood of a nation that had waited too long to be born. When Elijah King finally closed with the words, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the dam of silence burst. Applause exploded across the National Mall, a river of tears and joy and relief that no one there would ever forget. They knew, in that moment, that they had seen something beyond mere oratory. They had seen prophecy. The power of the march wasn't in the perfect sync of sound systems or the carefully planned stage. It was in the hearts of those who came, ordinary people who saw themselves reflected in every word, every cry, every hope. They came from fields of cotton and factories of steel, from Mississippi's red earth and New York's gray canyons, from small towns where every protest was a risk, and cities where every street was a battlefield. Some had never stepped foot outside their counties until that morning, but they packed cold sandwiches and rode buses that rattled through the night just to stand in that place. They were teachers and postal workers, mothers in stiff church dresses, grandfathers with battered hats and tired bones. They weren't just fighting for change, they were the change. They carried children on their shoulders so that they could see the statue of Lincoln at the far end of the reflecting pool, so that they could hear the sound of the world finally listening. There were new faces, too. A young firebrand named John Ellis, barely 23, and already a leader in the student movement. His speech had been so fierce that the elders had pulled him aside at the last moment and begged him to soften the edges. He'd agreed barely, but his words still burned like a forge, and the crowd felt every spark. And then there was Celia Banks, the only woman to take the microphone that day. She didn't speak for herself, though she could have. She read a statement on behalf of all the black women whose voices had been pushed to the edge even within their own movement. Her words were a quiet challenge to the men beside her, a reminder that freedom was for everyone, or it was for no one at all. Union leaders were there too, their banners stitched with the names of towns that had never seen a march like this. Rabbis and priests stood shoulder to shoulder, nuns in simple habits, and young men with guitars slung across their backs. Not everyone there agreed on the road to freedom. Some wanted to follow the gentle power of Elijah's voice. Others wanted the thunder of Malcolm's. But for one brilliant, blazing day, those differences didn't matter. They marched together, hands linked, singing as one. The air was alive with possibility. Buttons pinned to shirts glinted in the sun. Justice now. Freedom now. Everywhere. The murmur of 250, zero souls breathing together like the world itself, had stopped to watch. Behind the scenes, though, what looked like perfect unity was held together with spit and prayer and an iron will. The orchestrator of it all, Ray Kincaid, had built the whole day like a general laying out battle lines. He didn't care that some had called him too radical, or too quiet, or too stubborn. He knew that a single misstep could tip the day into chaos. So he tracked every bus like a general tracks battalions, timed every speech like a conductor guiding a symphony, and drilled every volunteer until they could hold the line even if the world itself was falling apart. This wasn't just a march. It was a war of hearts, and for that one day, under the unblinking sun of August, they all fought on the same side. The architect of the march, Ray Kincaid, had to navigate more than buses, and Banerjee had to outmaneuver politics itself. Every step of the way, eyes were on him, not just because he was a brilliant organizer, but because he lived openly as a gay man and carried the scars of once being a card-carrying leftist. Some civil rights leaders worried that his personal life would be used as ammunition to sabotage the whole movement. In fact, Congressman Aaron Carver had once threatened to publicly smear Kincaid and Elijah King as lovers if Kincaid wasn't removed from an earlier campaign. That threat loomed like a shadow over every late-night meeting and whispered strategy session. Then there was the glaring gap of women's voices. Women like Ella Carter, Diana Nellis, and Dorothy Helm had done the heavy lifting, drafting plans, training marshals, rallying support, but none were given a chance to stand at the microphone on that summer day. Rosa Parks, the quiet giant of the bus boycotts, was there, cherished by the crowd, but she wasn't invited to speak. Behind the stage's bright lights and stirring words lay an uncomfortable truth. Even within the movement for freedom, old hierarchies and blind spots persisted. Inside the Big Six, cracks showed. The young firebrands of the Student Coordinating Council, SCC, were increasingly fed up with the older generation's measured pace. They wanted to rip the system down to its foundation, not politely debate its edges. Core shared their restlessness, but for that one day, unity was the order no matter how tense the smiles. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with wary eyes and loaded pens. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI unleashed a wave of paranoia, assigning more than 100 agents to track every whisper and every handshake. Hotel rooms were bugged, phones tapped, notes taken. They expected violence, communist infiltration, or chaos in the streets. When none of that came to pass, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Elijah King. If peace was dangerous, they'd watch even harder. And then there was the matter of money. The march cost a staggering $250 million in today's dollars. Funds came from sympathetic unions and private donors, but the organizers were still scrambling up until the night before. They borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts, rigged sound systems with duct tape in desperation, and hoped the donations would cover the debt. For all its history-making impact, the March on Washington was a monument to human grit, messy, imperfect, political, and deeply unfinished, just like the nation it tried to heal. As the sun sank behind the Washington Monument, the crowd finally began to drift away. People clung to each other for a moment longer, reluctant to let go of what felt like holy ground. Hugs, tears, and songs rose up one last time, a final chorus echoing off the marble and the memories that would follow them home. The speeches had been spoken, the signs had been lifted high. The world had watched, and now the question hummed in the heavy August air: what happens next? In the days that followed, the media offered a measured, almost clinical admiration. Major papers called the march orderly and dignified, which was their polite way of saying no one had flipped cars or torched the White House. Most didn't spend much ink on the march's bold demands, like a federal jobs program or a living wage that would be worth around $20 an hour today, but they all covered Elijah King's words that at least they couldn't pretend not to hear. President John F. Callaway, who had first seen the march as a risky political mess, watched it on TV in the privacy of the White House. What he saw left him not just impressed, but deeply moved, perhaps even shaken by the force of a nation that had stood up together and said, "Enough." President John F. Callaway, who'd once worried the march would devolve into chaos, admitted afterward that it was a sight to behold. He met with civil rights leaders at the White House right after the final cheers faded, but while his admiration was genuine, progress in the marble halls of Congress remained a stubborn, snail-paced slog. His proposed civil rights bill was still stuck, like a bone in the throat of Southern legislators who had no intention of swallowing it. Some activists left Washington that day with a mix of triumph and frustration. They'd hoped to see laws passed the next morning. Instead, they returned to the front lines, organizing, marching, pushing forward, and mourning those who paid the ultimate price for daring to demand justice. That sobering reminder came swiftly. Just weeks later, on September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham became a tomb. A bomb ripped through the quiet morning, snatching away the lives of 4 young black girls who'd only come to sing and learn. The dream had been spoken, yes, but the nightmare of American racism wasn't even drowsy. Yet something had cracked open. The March on Washington wasn't just a diet, was a spark. It showed that mass protest could be precise, potent, and impossible to ignore. It drew together the most unlikely alliances: laborers, preachers, poets, and postal clerks woven together by the thread of justice. It gave the movement a new voice, a new story, a speech that would echo across generations and around the globe. The march ended, but the journey had only begun. Ahead lay a road paved in struggle and change, in the blood of martyrs and the ink of legislation. The March on Washington didn't just stir America's soul, it redrew its moral map. What had started as a daring gamble to gather thousands became the bedrock of civil rights history, a new gospel of democracy and defiance. Legislatively, the march didn't plant instant victories, but it tilled the soil of the American conscience. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. The ink on that law ended segregation in public spaces and banned discrimination in jobs based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act arrived, striking at the heart of Jim Crow's iron grip on black voters. Would these laws have passed without the march? Maybe. But would they have carried the same moral weight, the same thunderous mandate from the people themselves? Probably not. For Elijah King Jr., the words he unleashed on those marble steps elevated him from leader to legend. But fame came with its own dark crown: constant surveillance, death threats, and finally, a bullet in 1968. The dream he had dared to share became more powerful and more tragic year that followed. For the movement at large, The march was proof that unity wasn't a fantasy. It was a weapon. It gave future organizers a playbook for mobilizing entire communities. And it became a beacon, seen far beyond America's borders. Anti-apartheid fighters in South Africa, rebellious students in Europe, and tomorrow's champions of human rights all found inspiration in that day's example. The legacy isn't just a dusty chapter in history books. The language of that march, the promise of jobs and freedom, the image of black and white hands locked together in the hot August sun remains alive wherever people gather to say, "We are here and we will be heard." The spirit of peaceful defiance, the heartbeat of King's "I Have a Dream" speech still thrums in every modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter demonstrations, echoes of that historic 1963 gathering ripple out with every chant and every homemade sign. In Washington, D.C., King's image now towers in stone across the tidal basin from Lincoln's gaze. Visitors trace his resolute face, etched into granite with words that once rang through a summer sky. But the truest monument to that day isn't carved in marble. It's alive in classrooms, in ballot boxes, in marches, and in the voices that refuse to be hushed. Because that dream wasn't meant to be entombed in dusty history, it was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares each of us to rise and keep living it. It's been over 6 decades since 250. Zero souls stood shoulder to shoulder in the long shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, fusing hope and resolve into an unstoppable force. The March on Washington is now immortalized in documentaries, museum exhibits, and thick textbooks. King's voice clear, confident, and echoes in America's memory like a hymn that can't be silenced. Yet even as we memorize those immortal lines, one question lingers. Has the dream been realized, or has it merely been postponed? Some signs of progress can't be denied. The laws that once enforced segregation were torn down. Voting rights under siege once again in many states were won through the sweat of organizers and the pounding of marching feet. Black leaders now hold seats in government, serve as judges and mayors, and even took the highest office in the land, things unimaginable in 1963. And interracial marriage, once illegal in much of America, is now protected by federal law. These are no small milestones. They're victories carved out by generations who refuse to yield. And yet, beneath the headlines, the original cries of the march still haunt our streets unmet, unfulfilled. The demand for a living wage remains unanswered. Racial inequities in schools, housing, healthcare, and work still anchor themselves in neighborhoods and zip codes. Police brutality, the spark that lit early civil rights fires, still fuels modern fury, its shadow unchanged. The dream of genuine economic justice, of a nation where a child's future isn't determined by skin color or the street they call home, remains distant. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have inherited the spirit of that march. They carry its banners, its words, and its fire, marching the same boulevards, chanting the same demands. But they do so in a world transformed by hashtags, surveillance cameras, and new ways to fight and be seen. The March on Washington was never meant to be the final word. It was a thunderclap, a line in the sand, drawn for all to see. This is who we are. This is what we demand. It was a proclamation, not a conclusion. And so the dream remains shattered, tested, redefined, but still alive. Whether it is to be lost, twisted, or fully realized, lies not in the past, but in our own hands, our choices, our courage, and our willingness to stand up and keep marching until that dream is no longer an ideal, but a living, breathing reality.